بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن سهلا إذا شئت آمين. Okay, so the last surah that we covered was Surah Al-Balad, and in that surah we came across the ayah of Fakku Raqabatin, and the ayah translates to that Allah Ta'ala, He's listing out a few of the cases in which the Muslim should be practicing some certain humanitarian causes, and one of them is that he should be freeing slaves. So now, based off this ayah, we kind of went into the digression about what is slavery in Islam, and what are some of the ahkam and some of like the fiqh behind it basically, as well as how is this morally justified. I don't really like putting it like that, but I guess we could suffice for that for now. So regarding that, we were reading Mufti Taqi Osmani's translation of what he wrote in his work of Takmilatu Fath al-Mulhim. So we could continue reading that, inshallah. If you guys, I'll just give you guys a second to pull it up. I had sent it on the group like maybe sometime last week, huh? Yeah, I think it might have been on Monday last week. So, or actually, no, I think it was on Friday last week. So if you guys could just open that up and then we can start reading it. We basically read about half. He splits this up into two parts. The second part is whether or not slavery is abrogated, if it's mansukh, and then he's gonna talk about why that's not the case. And then the first part, which we had basically read through completely, was just some of the laws surrounding it, as well as some aqli dala'il. So this is alluding to some of the aqli dala'il. It's alluding to, yeah, Tram, what's up?
What paragraph did you guys stop at?
So if you scroll down, there's a bolded part. It says refutation of those who claim that slavery is abrogated. So that's basically where we're going to start from today, if I remember correctly. So that's about it's right about it's right about halfway through.
All right.
Okay, so yeah, no problem. Okay, so I just resent it on the group if you guys are having trouble finding it. Anyways, so I guess we could just do a quick summary of what we. Okay, so as I was saying, he kind of alluded to some of the aqli dala'il, some of like the logical and the how we prove it just based off of logic and rationale and like the non-religious argument for it. But he mainly just focuses on his on the religious arguments for it as well. And then, as you can see at the second half, which we'll be going through today, we'll talk about the why it's not abrogated. So just a quick summary. In the first paragraph, he talks about how slavery is seen as something that's a blemish to our deen, and that it's something that a lot of Muslims, particularly in the West, we tend to shy away from because we just see it as something that's just we think that it's something that we can't in any possible way justify it, and that this is like the one blemish that is found in our deen, and then we try to hide it. And then he says that he talks about the reason that people feel this way is because the concept of slavery that we have is like, especially in America, we think about like chattel slavery. People when Africans were brought over from their countries, and they were brought over through the transatlantic slave trade and all those sorts of things. We just think of it as something so debasing, something that causes so much difficulty, something that causes so much humiliation. And we also think of it in the sense that these people, when they were brought over from their respective countries, they were treated as pretty much subhuman. And they were treated as individuals that had no social rights, they had no human rights as well. However, he brings a quote, and he says that, a quote of a well-known European Orientalist, Professor Gustav something, and he writes that when the word slavery is spoken to a European or an American, a Westerner, who is accustomed to reading American novels written over the last 30 years, he pictures the exploitation of these poor people shackled in iron chains, driven by whips, and are barely alive and are living in dingy cabins. It does not concern me whether this description is authentic or in accords with the reality of what occurred for the English in America over a few short years, and whether it is even conceivable for a slave owner to entertain the idea of mistreating them and making them suffer torture and humiliation. But the last sentence, there is no doubt that the picture of slavery in Islam is absolutely different from the picture of slavery in Christianity. Then Mufti Saab says that once this has been settled, know that Islam came and while slavery was widespread, basically throughout the whole world, which I will actually be getting into later. I had basically, in terms of the Aqli Dala'il, which we'll be talking about after we're done with this paragraph, with this article, inshallah, we'll talk about how pretty much almost all civilizations practice some form of slavery in the past. Okay. So what Islam did was that although it did not prohibit slavery completely, nor did it render it totally void, rather it legislated rules for it and made boundaries for it in a way that made it a contribution to a human's well-being and the development of society. So now, one of the main things is that in history is that there was multiple different ways of just basically owning someone. However, Islam, what it did was that it specifically made it so that it was only through the medium of war, of jihad, that a person could have non-Muslims enter into their ownership. So that's one thing. And again, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail after we're done with the article. So while the Romans would force people into slavery because of committing some crimes, and while they would put the children of slave women into slavery, apart from the captives of war, it is only through this avenue of jihad that it is permissible in terms of sharia that a person could put anyone into slavery. Furthermore, slavery is not the only option for a captive of a jihad sanctioned by sharia. Rather, the imam, or like the khalifa at the time, he has 4 options with respect to them. He could either order their execution, he could put them into slavery, he could free them by ransom, or he can show favor to them and release them without any return. And the rest of the paragraph goes into these 4 options in more detail. So now if we look at them, logically, if you were to just kill everyone, then that doesn't help either. It doesn't give maximum benefit for either side, I guess I should say. If you were to just free them completely, then that's definitely a loss for the Muslims, because now what's going to happen is that you just have a whole bunch of soldiers that just came back to their hometown. Now they're ready to fight again. If you free them by ransom, okay, maybe that's one option that's there for the imam to take, so that perhaps maybe that's the best thing to do for in a particular situation, that he could maybe the Muslims are suffering a little bit financially, so taking money from the people that you captured from their respective homelands, then maybe that might be the best situation, and the imam could exercise that. Or what was the 4th option? He could put them into slavery. And we'll see why this was done and what's the moral argument behind this. So that's that paragraph, that longer paragraph. And then this next couple of paragraphs talk about how, moreover, Islam has afforded slaves rights that have no precedent in any other religion, meaning that we were the first ones to treat slaves in a certain way, such as these different ayat which mention that a person should be kind to their slaves, as well as many other ahadith that say basically treat your slave just like how you treat a family member. Make sure that they eat the same food that you eat, and make sure that they're wearing the same clothes that you wear. Additionally, there's a whole bunch of there's a lot of ahadith that he brings, and he says that such hadiths are plenty, but there isn't enough space here to exhaust them. In sum, Islam changed the system of slavery in a manner that made it one of mutual love and brotherhood, and nothing remained in slavery except the name of nothing remained in Islam except the name of slavery. In fact, Islam even changed the name of slavery, and then he brings that whole thing about how you shouldn't even address them as a slave. You should rather address them with love and with respect. And then this is not just this is an important point actually that he brings, is that he says this is not just something that we're saying because we have this written in our books of fiqh and stuff like that. This is all these ahadith are mentioned, but it's possible that maybe they weren't even practiced upon by the Muslim civilizations. What he does is he brings proofs that yes, most certainly they were practiced upon by our predecessors, in which he mentions that some of these slaves were actually they were treated so well, they were even gained these like the fame and the status of like being the best ulama in their respective nations, in their respective hometowns. And he gives a list of Ata bin Abi Rabah in Mecca, as well as others in their respective locations. Even in Ottoman history, you find that some of these slaves became sultans, and they became like the actual like the wazirs and like the leaders of the Ottomans, and so on and so forth. Additionally, we have this section that he brings here about the fada'il of freeing slaves. Mm, I don't mean to skip over it and like out of because it's not important or something. Of course, it's definitely important. It's all hadith of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but just for the sake of time. And then, so there are a lot of the fada'il of freeing slaves. He brings in these next three paragraphs. Then we come to thus there are a few examples. Okay, another couple of paragraphs regarding the fada'il of freeing slaves, the virtue of freeing slaves, and the reward that a person gets. Okay. And then he brings a couple of quotations from non-Muslims regarding. We should cite here some testimonies from some of the Westerners who observed the conditions of the slaves in Islam. A French writer said that slavery is not a blemish in the Islamic lands. All the sultans of Constantinople, who were Muslim rulers, I just said this, were all born from the wombs of slave women, and that did not diminish their bravery and their courage. The rulers of Egypt would often purchase slaves, educate them, nurture them, and then marry them to their daughters. When you examine the rulers of Cairo and its leaders and the generals of its army, you will find that most of them were those who were sold into slavery in their young age for a price of 800 to 1200 gold coins. I'm assuming gold. And then he brings a bit more. Okay, so that's pretty much what we had covered. So again, he's talking about maybe not exactly. He alluded to some of the aqli arguments, some of the logical arguments, but a lot of that was talking about. He brought a lot of ayat and ahadith. So, like I said, we'll go over like the aqli stuff in after we're done with this article. This next part, it's a bit long, and I don't think we need to go through it word for word like how we did the previous part. So I'll just pick and choose what to mention from this second half of this article, which is the refutation of those who claim that slavery is abrogated. So, like I said, a lot of people they kind of see, or not kind of, they definitely see some slavery as something that just can't be justified at all. So, one way they try to justify it is by saying that it's mansukh. It has no what the purpose of slavery was like how the ayat of drinking khamr were revealed. The ayat of drinking khamr, of drinking wine, were revealed successively. The first ayat talking about how, yeah, it's not the best thing. The second ayat that was revealed regarding the prohibition of khamr said that, you're just not allowed to drink it when it's time for salah. If it's like late at night, way well after you already prayed your isha and it's well before fajr, you can fine, go ahead and drink alcohol if you want. And the third ayat that was revealed was the complete and total prohibition of wine and khamr. So now that's kind of what the argument that this group tries to make is that as we could see all these beautiful ahadith and ayat that we read previously, or that we skipped over for now, but that we read on the other day, perhaps these are showing to us that at one point in the future, it is appropriate to say that slavery has been abrogated. So now this definitely is not the case. Okay, this absolutely unequivocally is not the case. That's not what's going on here. For us to, after the demise and the death of our beloved Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there's absolutely nothing that we could change about the Sharia. Correct? I'm sure we all agree on that. Allah Ta'ala says, I think did I mention this previously? اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. Allah Ta'ala says, and this is one of the final verses that was revealed. There's actually some discussion to say that this was the final verse that was revealed, but if not, if it's not the final verse that was revealed, it's one of the final verses that was revealed, in which Allah Ta'ala says, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم. Today is the day that I have now perfected for you your religion. أكملت لكم دينكم. I made it كامل. وأتممت عليكم نعمتي. And I have now completed this blessing upon you all. The blessing of revelation and of prophethood, because of course, now that it was the end of the life of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that blessing was now coming to an end. وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. And Allah Ta'ala is saying, وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا, and I am pleased as Islam for the religion for you all, يعني till the end of till Yawm al-Qiyamah, As we know, there's not going to be no new Sharia, there's going to be no new revelation, there's going to be no new prophet till the day of judgment. This is the Sharia that Allah Ta'ala is pleased with. And anyone who believes in that which Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam brought and lives his life according to this Sharia, then inshallah he will enter into Jannah. Okay, so with that being said, for people to make this argument that we can now say that, especially in our times, slavery is abrogated, then that's okay. That's just totally like way out of bounds. Okay. Anyways, okay. So now let's let me refutation of those who claim that slavery is abrogated. Okay. So in recent times, you guys are able to find it. You guys are on the right spot. Okay, perfect. So in recent times, many of the Europeans objected to the rule of slavery in Islam, ignorant or feigning ignorance of its conditions and its limits and its wisdoms and its powerful effects in history. Then a group stood from amongst the Muslims apologizing on behalf of Islam and distorting it based on the whims of the Westerners. So this is pretty much what I said. They feel like they have to, these Muslims feel like they have to apologize on behalf of Islam, that Islam is that which is making a mistake, and they distort the teachings of our religion to make it muwafiq, to make it congruent with the beliefs and the idea of justice and of freedom and basically like a liberal ideology, and they to try to make it congruent with the liberal ideology. Thus, they said that slavery is not permissible in Islam today, and it was only allowed in the beginning of Islam. Then this permission was abrogated in the later parts of the life of the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Excuse me. He says from where did I start? Okay, from those in India who defended this weak and false claim is the famous writer Chiragh Ali. I'm not sure how to pronounce that first name, who was a colleague of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan. He wrote an article in his book, The Greatest Statement on the Ascension of Islam, to prove this claim, and he produced therein weak evidences which will make even the bereaved laugh. We have no need to cite these evidences and refute them, as they are such that all who have the slightest grasp of religion and knowledge will regard them as baseless, but he produced a doubt in the book which may be confusing to some people, so we wish to discuss it and refute it. So he cited Allah Ta'ala's statement in Surah Muhammad, where Allah Ta'ala says, when you have thoroughly subdued them, bind a bond firmly on them, then it is either generosity or ransom. Meaning Allah Ta'ala gives a choice here in the ayah of Surah Muhammad. It's always better to read the Arabic, right? فإذا لقيتم الذين كفروا فضرب الرقاب حتى إذا أثخنتموهم فشدوا الوثاق فإما منا بعد وإما فداء. Okay, so this is the ayah that he's quoting in Surah Muhammad, ayah number 4. That again, basically, once you if you're in war and you're at war with the enemy and you're able to beat them, you have this. What this ayah is stating is that you have two options: imma manna wa imma fida'a. Either you could be generous and you could free them, or you can fida'a, or you can ransom them, or you could take money in exchange for your war prisoners, for your captives. So Allah, he said, Allah Ta'ala mentioned only two options for the prisoners of war: generosity or ransom, and he did not mention execution or enslavement. Meaning Allah Ta'ala, like we said earlier in the article, we mentioned four options, right? The two that aren't mentioned in this ayah are killing them all and enslaving them, putting them into as taking them as slaves. Thus, it is evident that they were commands at the start of Islam, but this is abrogated thereafter. So this is what this Chiragh, or whatever this guy's name, Ali's, this is his argument. So since this doubt has confused the matter for some people, we should respond to it in some detail. So know that there is no evidence in this verse whatsoever for the prohibition of taking slaves and the abrogation of its permissibility, and that it is for a number of reasons. So Mufti Saad is going to discuss why that is. So if we were to look, number one, if we were to look at the words of this verse, we see that they do not negate enslavement, because the word imma manna wa imma fida'a, is giving a choice, does not prove restriction at all. So this word specifically, he's giving from the Arabic itself, just proving linguistically as to why this opinion of this Chiragh Ali just makes no sense. This wording, this of bringing the word imma does not prove restriction at all, and this word is used in the meaning of excluding the possibility of combining options. As in the statement, sit either with Hassan, who's on one side of the room, for example, or sit with Zaid, but you can't do both. You would have to, if you wanted to sit with Hassan, you're not going to be able to sit with Zaid because it's just not possible to sit with the both of them as they're in two completely different areas. Okay, so that's basic. Just to add more detail to that sentence, that's pretty much what the ayah is saying, that you could either do this one completely or you could do that one completely. Okay, and then he says, Ibn Hisham says that the imma has 5 meanings, but inshallah we can skip that. So it is thus evident in the next paragraph, after the indented paragraph, that it is thus evident that imma does not have the meaning of restriction. Yes, when this word is used in between two opposite entities, it comes to restriction, not because it is from the meanings of the word imma, but because of the opposition between the two entities rationally. And since rationally a third thing can be added to generosity and ransom in the verse, it is evident that the word imma is not for restriction in the view, but is in the meaning of permission by way of negating the possibility of combining between the various options, not actual exclusion. Okay, so that was a bit long, but I think when I had just explained the whole sit either with Hassan or Zaid, then hopefully that made it a bit more clear. Let's see what else he says. I don't want to read this whole thing because I think it goes into a little bit, it goes into quite some detail. But another possible proof that we could use is that, okay, number 4, if we scroll down all the way to number 4, I was actually going to give something similar, is that it is established from the Prophet ﷺ that he took slaves in more than one instance after the revelation of this verse. Okay, so this is a very, very obvious proof that if the verse is revealed, let's say sometime in the 5th year, and then 6th year and 7th year and 8th year of after Hijrah, Nabi ﷺ started taking slaves, then we could very well tell that the ayah is maybe not exactly what it seems, or not exactly what this Shiraf Ali guy was saying it's supposed to be. So, it is established from the Prophet ﷺ that he took slaves in more than one instance after the revelation of this verse, as he enslaved the women and children of Banu Qurayza, which was shortly after Ahzab. And he enslaved the women of Khaybar, and from them Safiya radiallahu ta'ala anha, and he enslaved Banu al-Mustaliq, and from them was Juwayriyah radiallahu ta'ala anha, and he enslaved the women of Autas, as has preceded, and the women of Hawazin, and he distributed them amongst the soldiers. Additionally, we find the last statement, like literally the last words of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam were about slaves. So that's another way to prove that this is not mansukh. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "As-salah, as-salah, wa ma malakat yaminuk." That Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his last advice, literally as like in English, what we say like they're a person's like in their dying breath, what he was saying was that make sure that you're praying your salah, make sure that you're fulfilling this right of Allah Ta'ala, and make sure that you're fulfilling the right of people by being kind to these slaves, by being by treating what your right hand possesses well. So permissibility of slavery and recognition of right hand ownership is evident in this. Hence, there is no ruling more decisive than this, and there is no possibility of abrogation therein at all, as it is the final word of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Thereafter, now this is actually exactly what I was going to mention, is that we see that thereafter slavery remained. You guys can see where I'm reading from. It's right before the second to last. It's the second to last paragraph, pretty much before the article finishes, not including the note. So he says, thereafter, slavery remained an institution practiced by the Ummah in the time of the Sahaba and those after them, radiallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in, and no one condemned it. So this is another big proof, is that we see that these one way to discern what the Sunnah is. So this is a qaida that you guys could just remember, that one way to discern what the Sunnah is the practice of the Sahaba, radiallahu ta'ala anhum. This is also called ijma'. That if they all agree on something, if all the Muslims are agreeing on something, then this is actually a qat'i proof. So perhaps you guys are familiar with some usul al-fiqh terms, and that there's 4 ways that we as Muslims are able to establish our religious dictations, I guess you want to call it that. Anything that are that Sharia demands from us, it could be proven through 4 ways. That is the Quran, the Sunnah of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ijma' and qiyas. Okay, so that's the 4th way. The Quran, which is called Al-Kitab, As-Sunnah, Ijma', or the consensus of a group of all Muslims, as well as qiyas. So now, earlier in the early generations, the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, you didn't have anyone like objecting, saying that I think that perhaps this amal of slavery, of taking of concubines and taking like sex slaves and taking all these things, I'm pretty sure this is mansukh. No one said that. So now we see that because all the Sahaba are agreeing on something, for us to say that in our time, especially that, perhaps maybe they had misunderstood the religion, that's just absolute nonsense. Okay. Anyways, thereafter, slavery remained an institution practiced by the Ummah in the time of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum and those after them, and no one condemned it. Were they all, and protection is from Allah, ignorant of the verse of generosity and ransom? Were the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, did they not like understand the Arabic that was being relayed to them of this ayah? Like who were obviously they were masters of the language. Was there no one from amongst them who understood the Quran in its entirety? Would they not give the laws of Allah Ta'ala? Would they not give attention to the laws of Allah Ta'ala? Can anyone conceive of this from the Sahaba, the Tabi'een, the Fuqaha, the Muhaddithun, who spent their lives and their wealth in the path of conveying the pure religion, and they did not fear in that the blame of the blamer? So this is like a common Arabic term. Like what do they call those? Like idioms or something? وَلَا يَخَافُونَ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ. They just speak the truth and they don't care what anyone else has to say about it. وَلَا يَخَافُونَ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ. Anyone who wants to say anything to them, they upset someone, they hurt someone's feelings. وَلَا يَخَافُونَ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ. If it's in pursuit of truth, they always speak the truth. Thus, so this last paragraph before the note. Thus, the clear manifest truth is that taking slaves is permissible in Islam with its laws and limits, which have preceded, and nothing has abrogated it. And there are wisdoms in this which we have explained, and the opinion of its abrogation is rejected and is against consensus. So whenever we see the word consensus, just remember ijma, which is one of the four definitive proofs of our religion, and has no proof from the proofs of the Sharia. To say that slavery is abrogated is just like 110% batil. It's incorrect. Okay, what does this note say? I don't think I read this when I... Okay, this was whatever. We could skip that note. Okay, any questions regarding what we've read so far? Perhaps maybe like a fiqh thing behind it, or... Again, like I said, we're going to go through some of the aqli dala'il right now. And then if you... Yeah, you just text me. Yeah. If I don't see it, just text me again, and inshallah it'll pop up back at the top. So yeah, cool. No problem. Okay, so as for the aqli dalail, okay, so just a disclaimer. I just tried to. Okay. Two things. Let me mention two things first. Where I got this information from, like just to be able to express this argument in a very cohesive and a well formulated manner, I listened to one scholar, one Muslim intellectual, I'll call him, as well as spoke to a scholar friend of mine regarding this topic. I personally have never actually talked about this topic before, nor have I went into it in so much detail before we started talking about it actually. So jazakumullah khairan to all of you for that. But I just wanted to make sure I got this idea of or I got this argument across properly. I won't say their names because maybe I could say it off recording. But when I had spoken to my friend, one important thing that I took notes while I was talking to him, so let me just read off that. One important thing to note is that we cannot have to view Islam through a Western mindset is our own problem. Okay, so I apologize, you guys can't see me right now, but because I'm reading off this thing. But let me just bear with me for a little bit. That to view Islam through a Western mindset, it's almost like our own spiritual sickness. And I might even argue that perhaps you could say that it's part of du'ful iman. is part of our own iman being weak, our own faith being weak. The fact that perhaps obviously there's a difference between having questions and maybe there's some things that you're not used to and that you want clarification on. I won't call that like having a weak iman. There's just something that you just need clarification on, right? But for people to, like, for example, those individuals who try to act as if the blemish is on our deen, and they try to go so far as to make something mansukh, which is clearly not mansukh. Like, like what else is that? If you're not going to call that du'af iman, if you're not going to call that having like weak iman, like what else can you call that really, right? And so when I was speaking to his brother, that's definitely something he told me to mention first and foremost, that we, not just in the issue of slavery, but even things like how we view the relationship between men and women, what the relationship between like a husband and wife is, how society should work, and whether it's a big issue, small issue. Sometimes because these things kind of go against how we've been growing up, they go against our, depends on how immersed you are in like the Western culture. We have some feeling inside of us that just kind of you know have that this feeling inside of us builds a shubha in our mind, and that shubha being the that perhaps this is um like basically how does our deen justify why it's doing what it's doing. Okay, with that being said, we could talk a bit more about like the actual logical arguments for slavery. So now, like I said, I spoke to. So that was the first thing. Now the second thing that I wanted to mention was, like I said, I listened to my friend. I listened to a scholar online, or an intellectual online. I won't call him a scholar. Um, and I spoke to my friend. So I apologize again if it's a little bit like messy or unorganized when I say this. But inshallah, if you're taking notes, then inshallah, I don't think it should be too big of a deal. I listened to like 3 of his videos and I took notes on it. So it's going to be like, there might be like points where you're thinking that like, hey, we just switched topics completely. Like, where did that come from? It's probably because I'm going from like the information in one video to the information in another video. And okay, so let's just get started. I think that's pretty much it that I wanted to mention before we start. Okay. So, how to You know what? Let me give the short version. How about that? I can just start with this. The short version of the argument of the moral why slavery is morally justified. You may like honestly like you could try to rack your brain over this as long as you want. I don't think anyone could like any of us could just like sit down and just think of it. Actually, do you guys have any reasons? Anyone feel like they could present an argument as to why slavery is morally justified? Like if you like think about this as an American, a guy that's just either born in America, or you guys I'm assuming that most of you guys, or if not all of you guys, are born in America. You're about to try to justify slavery. That's got to be like the cardinal sin as an American. Okay, but go ahead. Anyone want to take a shot? You're gonna be looked at as like, I mean, if we did this outside of the setting I'm talking about, it's like, you're like Hitler Thani at that point if you're trying to justify slavery. Yeah, Thoban, go ahead. Thanks, man. After all that, after I just said all that, I thought I made you guys scared, but inshallah, no judgment.
And I just first off, and I think if you really starting off from the point where you said being justified slavery, the cardinal sin in America, I feel like America as a whole kind of used slavery as kind of to show themselves as to be moral people from the very get go. So if you really think about it, the Emancipation Proclamation, the thing that I guess quote unquote freed all slaves, was not the main reason the Civil War happened. The Civil War happened was because there was an imbalance of power between both the North and South in America.
Mm-hmm.
The Emancipation Proclamation happened later, and then Americans pretty much took this whole little thing and took advantage of it and used the Civil War as more of rather than a conflict of the balance of make it look like a conflict of balance of power, try to make it look like more of a conflict between moral and immoral. So using this, they kind of used a way, okay, America is a symbol of freedom and hope and, individuality and whatnot. And another thing is that when most people think of the word slavery, they think of America's version of slavery. They think of,
Yes, great point.
they have being, slaves being treated extremely poorly, slaves being treated like disheveled homes, being beaten on a daily basis, being with chains, having, I don't know, chain links on their necks and whatnot, all those different things that you read on history books. But you have to keep in mind that America's version of slavery was not the same exact version of slavery that was present throughout the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
Get it? So, if you were to take an American and then bring him, I guess, an American from the 1700s or 1600s, whichever one you want to take, and then put him inside the Arab subcontinent at the time where slavery was prevalent there, and you were to tell him, oh, slavery is an extremely, and that American was to go to the Arab and say, oh, slavery is an extremely immoral thing, it's so horrible, it's all that kind of stuff. The Arab would look to him and say, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to understand the Arab style of slavery, or at least the slavery that was prevalent during Islam, is not the same thing as American slavery. People, I guess, slaves around that time were not just treated as, just property or just like chattel,
Mm-hmm.
They weren't treated as horribly. People would kind of, I guess, see at least Muslim slave owners, rather than just oppressors, they'd see them somewhat as mentors,
Mm-hmm.
A slave master they would provide for, they would, they would give them food, water, education, employment opportunities, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the greatest Muslim rulers were also at some point either they were the children of slaves or they were slaves themselves.
Yeah.
Some of the most wealthy icons in Islam were also slaves at some point in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I
So
think Mufti
when
Saba brought that too, right? We talked about how they were. It wasn't like a racist, almost like an ethnic division of when slaves were integrated into the Islamic
yeah,
society.
here's another thing that I guess slavery kind of says. It kind of implies that there's a huge ethnic division between whites and blacks. But you have to keep in mind that slavery, at least the one that was practiced in Islam, there was no ethnic division.
Yeah.
You can be Persian and be a slave. You can be African. You can be a slave. You can be a Roman. You can be a slave. You can be Greek. You can be a slave. You can be Arab. You can be a slave. Like, there was no specific ethnic division. Okay, if you're black, you're probably most likely a slave. If you're white, you're most likely either free or you're the master of a slave. You get it? So I feel like there's a huge disconnect between American style of slavery and the Muslims, I guess, permitted style of slavery.
Jazakumullah khairan. I think actually, I don't know. You're kind of hitting the points on what the Yaqeen article on slavery had mentioned. I'd read that as well. I don't think it's a pretty long read. If you guys want to read that, I could send the link, inshallah, if you guys just want to go through it. I think one of the focuses that they put on is that defining slavery. And if you go into the definition of slavery, which I was actually going to bring up a little bit later, was that if you go into the definition of slavery, is that, especially in that article, they kind of argue that, a lot of what we may think, what we like as, 21st century Americans think of as like just contractual obligations from employer to employee, that is also like at a fundamental level that could also be considered as slavery as well. So, for example, let me just skip some of this beginning stuff that I was going to mention, and I could start from right here. There's this work by David Gerber. I have no idea how to pronounce that last name, but it's called Debt. And he basically looks at like a 5,000 history of the world, 5,000 year history of the world going backwards. And he argues that if you were to bring someone from the past, if you were to bring like some giant like figure from the past, like let's say like Aristotle or I don't know, some king or something. And anyway, you bring Aristotle to the present, and you were to drop them in the present, and he was to see the society that's present today. He would think that most people are slaves. So, like you mentioned, Philban, our idea of slavery, usually when we hear the word slavery, it kind of triggers something like a psychological reaction in our minds, where we think of, like you said, chattel slavery or the transatlantic slavery when the white Americans were bringing blacks over from Africa, and they were basically forcing them into labor. Now, this was not slavery for majority of the past. Like for like 99% of the past, this was not how slavery looked. And you could it's also proven that like almost every single civilization, whether it was like their entire economic system or whether it was like a small population of a civilization, but every single civilization, almost every single civilization, I should say, practiced some form of slavery. Okay, so now as for the okay, so that's pretty much what that was some of what Soban was mentioning. Now, as for the let me just go back to the top here. If we look at the argument for the moral justification of why slavery took place in our Islamic history and why it was allowed, is that there's a book called War Before Civilization by Lawrence Keeley. Again, War Before Civilization. And he says that pre-modern war was mainly about manpower. That if you have a bigger army, you'll be able to defeat the little army. And if you have the bigger army, you'll be able to win. If you yourself, if you and your nation, your civilization has a smaller army, most likely that means that someone, whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from now, someone's gonna come, and if they have a bigger army, they're gonna be able to defeat you, and you're gonna be the losers. So it's literally what he's arguing is that it's all about numbers, and the numbers. So now, if it depends on numbers, if it depends on how big your army is, the most important thing for that civilization is having soldiers. And the only way to have soldiers is completely dependent on how many fertile wombs are in your civilization. It's completely dependent on how many women there are that can give birth to men that can give birth, and so that eventually you could have a big enough army to either defend yourself or that you could be the one that's uh, beating other armies that are you could be the one that's on offense, or you could just protect yourself while you're on defense. So he also says loss and gain of men will not change the demographic position of a civilization, but if you have too few women, that is the difference between thriving and being annihilated. Okay, so all of all pre-modern civilizations, what they completely depended on was the amount of women that were in their nation, so that they could eventually just leads to the amount of soldiers that they have in their army. So now, if we look at it from this way, and we say that, um, sorry, we say it gives a reason as to why pre-modern civilization would take sex slaves. So now all pre-modern civilizations would take sex slaves, and if you did not take these concubines, you were at a huge disadvantage militarily, because either you take them, and if you take them as sex slaves, then you're able to reproduce with them, and again, what's that doing? All that's doing is just adding to the army, which is going to defend you and yourself, your civilization, your hometown, whatever you value, your beliefs, all these sorts of things. Either you take them, or you face annihilation. Okay, which is pretty much the state of the entire world at that time. Either you have a big enough army where you're the one that's gonna live and you're not gonna be dying in the war, or you're the one that's gonna end up one day just hearing a knock on your door and someone just gonna end up killing you and taking your women. Okay, that's how it worked. Okay, so although neither option is, what do we call it? Like happy, I guess. Like neither options, like both options of either taking the slaves or completely facing annihilation. Like both of those are gonna churn your stomach. That's the entire nature of war. Wait, war is something that's not going to be something that's pleasant. It's not going to be something that's going to be like handled in the best manner at all times between two nations that are in conflict with one another. It's going to get bloody. It's going to get really grotesque. It's going to get really, really violent. There is no third option. Either you take these women, like you have to kill all the soldiers, obviously, or else they'll regroup and they'll be able to attack you later. So you have to kill all the soldiers, and then what do you do with the women? Either you could take them back to where you are, back to your civilization that's thriving, that's flourishing, and then of course you would, like I said, the it's just a numbers game, and you could reproduce with them, or you could just leave them there to fend for themselves. Okay, and realistically, how long is that going to last if there's just a bunch of women and children in the middle of a civilization with no men working or doing anything in that civilization anymore? So yes, taking sex slaves is not just morally justified, but it was actually necessary before the pre-modern civilization. So that itself is enough in an argument. Does regarding this, when I heard this, I thought this was pretty convincing. That I don't see why, like what ishkal a person could make on this in terms of especially in like a pre-modern, and referring to like pre-modern, like pre-modern civilizations, like what ishkal, what objection could a person make against this argument? Could you guys think of anything? Honestly, I'm like genuinely asking because this seems like a pretty legit argument. That it's just a numbers game. Either you take those women and you're able to add to your army so that you could defend your own hometown, you could defend your own values, you could defend your own civilization, or you leave them there to die. Or like let's say you just did leave them there, then what's gonna happen? Either they themselves are just gonna like die off, or some other army is gonna come and take them, and that enemy army possibly could just use them to reproduce, and they themselves are gonna get a stronger nation. So like what fourth, like third or fourth option is there, depending on how you count it? Anyone? No? Like, yeah, go ahead.
Also, this is kind of related to the question, but I wanted to ask your opinion on something else as to why I feel like, okay, if you were to explain this sort of, I guess, analogy of, this more reasoning behind it, it's a lot harder for people in Western society to kind of grasp. I feel like when you're explaining this, I guess, reasoning, you're doing it from a perspective of where survival is, I guess, your number one priority. And I guess here in Western civilization, at least here in America, like people have become like so, I guess, is comfortable. I guess is a better word to say it, is that they've as that the whole prioritization of survival has kind of been thrown out. So now you're just kind of now that the whole aspect of survival has been pretty much thrown out of the window, you're just kind of left with, okay, what's, I guess, what makes everyone, I
Happy.
guess, what gives everyone a happy ending,
Yeah,
or
I
what
think.
makes everyone
Yeah, I would.
morally
I
correct
I
and whatnot.
completely. I get what you're saying. That's a utilitarian argument. I guess I think that's like the proper philosophical term for that. Is that utilitarianism is it's like the branch which deals with it's a branch which deals with well-being and like human well-being. So how do we gauge what is the best thing for a person? And it claims that the best thing for a person is that which derives the maximum pleasure. Okay, so now that's pretty much what you're saying, right? We shouldn't look at it from a survival thing, but let's just take it a step above that, which is where we are in terms of our society now. Let's look at it from a pleasure aspect. I feel would it this would also include that as well, no? Because being like, unless you're willing to say that being taken as a slave is not better than dying,
Yeah, that's true, actually.
because if you're taken as a slave,
That's good.
at least you have the option of possibly going back to the state of freedom, and then you could do whatever you want to derive pleasure. I mean, not even as a slave, like you're living mutlaqan in general is going to be a state of deriving more pleasure than being dead. Like you know, of that if that makes sense. Maybe
Yeah,
I
yeah, that's
okay.
okay.
Is Hawk, you're about to say something?
No, so I was just agreeing with the past.
Okay, okay,
I'm sorry I'm not discussing a lot. I'm just
no, no,
I'm
you're
in
good,
like
man.
a dorm, so.
No, no, no problem, bro. No problem at all. Yeah, so either if like from the survivor aspect, I guess as Soban put it, yeah, it would seem like this is this argument makes sense from a utilitarian aspect. Yeah, this argument seems to make sense as well because either the choice is that you're dying or you're going to be taken as a slave, whether it's willfully unwillfully. Like that's and from a utilitarian aspect, then like I don't see how like a liberal like atheist or someone would be able to refute this argument. Okay, now we have about 6 minutes left, so let me just read at least this first part. So it's worth to mention that our Sharia, as we had discussed, it integrated slaves in a in the most beautiful fashion and in the most humane way than compared to any other civilization. So, for example, for women, you can't mutilate them, or for any slave or for any human being, you can't mutilate them. You can't just because you have like a woman as your concubine, as your sex slave. It's not like you could just put her on the street and like prostitute or something as other civilizations would do. If she were to give birth to her master's baby, automatically she becomes a ummul walad. That's the term in our fiqh books. And what happens is that as soon as when the master dies, then she's automatically free. And there's a lot of other examples, as we saw all those hadith that we had read in Mufti Taqi's article that about freeing slaves and all sorts of these things. So we see that the deen, what Islam does is that ensures that slaves, after maybe one or even two generations, they're eventually free most of the time. Like that's how it kind of ends up happening, especially like with these like with the concubines, with the sex slaves. Like eventually, like after 1 or 2 generations, if not her children will be free, and they'll be free to integrate with the Islamic society and they'll be part of the Islamic society. Whereas other civilizations, I think you had mentioned this, Soban, it would just be a constant generation after generations for decades, for centuries, that there'll be, just because you're part of a certain class, because you're part of a race, because we invaded your country 100 years ago, and you're still like, um, you're not part of our society, you're not part of our ethnicity. We will continue, just because your great 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 grandfather was captured, we'll continue to treat you as a slave. So this is like, there's like no possibility at all for those people in other civilizations to be able to integrate fully with their society. So as I said, slavery in war, it's not like it's a fun thing to talk about. It's not like it's like something like that doesn't cause your stomach to churn or something like that. But like we said, our deen encompasses every single aspect of life. And as I said, the ayah, اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. This Allah Ta'ala has perfected our religion. Okay, and one of the maqasid of the Sharia, if one of the one of the main things that the Sharia does is that it preserves family and marriage. And I'm sure we could very well argue that it does a much better job than, what the Western and a liberal form of human rights claims that it does. Even if continuing with this topic about how it's like slavery in Islam compared to others civilization, is that if you look at other civilizations, you can see that some of them would become like almost cannibalistic in nature. Is that they would eat the dead people. Even I'm sure you guys are familiar when Hind, she started, although she didn't eat it, I don't think but she started biting at the organs of the cousin of, or the uncle of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hamza, after their after the battle of Uhud. Excuse me. And of course, you can't just torture just for the sake of torture. That's like explicitly prohibited in Islam. And according to the majority, even like in terms of like our code of conduct when it comes to jihad and when it comes to war, is that you can't like fight non-combatants. You can't like just start killing women, start killing old people. You can't even kill monks and stuff like that, people that are unarmed. So war, it's conflict is like, it's a part of human nature, and war is inevitable. But what really matters is that how are we going to engage in war morally, and what code of conduct that we have. And we find many humanitarian rules of justice in our turath. We find it in the Quran and the Sunnah, and of course from the scholars when they wrote their books of fiqh and so on, and siyar and all those sorts of things. And we find that they themselves, they practice upon these humanitarian rules, and they just laid out the rules for us to follow as well.